Hey, it's Jordan with TYT Network. It is Monday, April 4th, a day before the Wisconsin primary. And I have Ari Berman, who is with thenation.com. He's a senior contributing writer. He actually came out with a book last year. I happen to have it, thanks to my producer.
Oh, nice.
Give Us the Ballot, which is a really in-depth history of voter suppression, voting rights in America. And he just wrote a piece for The Nation about how 300,000 Wisconsinites might not be able to vote because of the harsh voter suppression tactics. So I want to start out there. What a lot of people know about Scott Walker with the union busting, but what has he put in place over the last few years to make this election tougher for minorities, young people, even veterans, I read in your piece, to vote?
Well, hey, Jordan. So I think Scott Walker's been as aggressive in cracking down on democracy as he has been on restricting union rights. Basically, what Wisconsin did is in 2011, they passed a very restrictive photo ID law for voting that was blocked in the courts for a number of years, but approved by a panel of Republican judges in 2014. So the 2016 election is the first time this photo ID law is in effect. It's a big deal because 300,000 registered voters, 9% of the electorate, don't have a government-issued ID in Wisconsin. There's a clear racial disparity. Blacks and Hispanics are twice as likely, 2 to 3 times as likely as whites not to have this ID. Many people in Wisconsin don't have birth certificates, or they have to pay hundreds of dollars to access them, which they need to get an ID. So that is why courts in the past have labeled this law a poll tax. Students have been targeted because students can't use their IDs at most places to vote. They have to print separate IDs because student IDs at University of Madison, for example, University of Wisconsin-Madison, they don't have signatures or 2-year expiration dates, which the legislature required knowing that these schools didn't comply. So now schools are having to print all new IDs. So you're talking about voters of color, younger people, lower income people, first-time voters, all who are very impacted by this law. In addition to the voter ID law, Wisconsin Republicans also cut early voting on nights and weekends. They made it virtually impossible to do voter registration drives. They passed a bunch of other under-the-radar voting restrictions that all has a totality of making it much more difficult to vote in the state.
And something that stuck out to me in your piece, because I had a nightmare trying to get my own license renewed, is the DMV hours.
Yeah.
So the DMV might be open, some of them 2 days a week, very restricted hours. So even if you want to get through, you want to take the initiative to get a license or whatever documentation, your piece kind of detailed how you have to jump through many, many hoops. Oftentimes people can't do that.
Yeah, and it's extremely ironic to me that the same Republicans that are always railing against big government have made the DMV the arbiter of voting. It's completely absurd and ridiculous. In Wisconsin, only 31 of 92 DMVs are open 5 days a week. I don't think people realize just how hard it is to access the DMV in this state. There's one county in Wisconsin, John Oliver covered this, that's only open 5 Wednesdays a year. 5 Wednesdays a year. And this is what you have to do this would be funny if it wasn't the fact that you have to now go to this place to be able to vote. And what we're seeing is people who have voted all their lives are applying for free IDs at the DMV, and they're getting denied. So they've had no problem voting for decades, and all of a sudden now they're going through this horrible bureaucratic process. They're getting rejected. They're being told they have to pay hundreds of dollars for documents that they never needed before. And this is really unfortunate because there's no evidence of voter fraud. There's no evidence of voter impersonation to justify all these barriers in the first place.
And like in many other states, minorities are very disproportionately hit by this. Your piece started out talking about a 74-year-old who moved from Mississippi to Wisconsin a few years ago, and he had to go through hoops. Minorities, some of them can't afford a new ID. Some of them, for whatever reason, not just minorities, but some people don't even have a birth certificate for one reason or the other. Have these people, has there been a success rate in these folks trying to get the IDs, or most of them have not even taken the steps because it's just not practical?
Well, some people have gotten IDs. I think last year Wisconsin issued about 40,000 IDs. So definitely some people have gotten them, but others have not. Others have not been able to afford the documents, or they have not been able to get copies of their birth certificate. I am seeing problems with elderly minority voters in a bunch of states who were born at home in the segregated South. when there virtually were no black hospitals, and they never got birth certificates. So they're having a tremendous amount of trouble trying to prove their documentation under these very restrictive laws. They've had no problem voting in the past. They've had no problem navigating through society. They've been totally fine. But all of a sudden now, with these restrictive voter ID laws, they're having a tremendous amount of problems getting their documentation. And I think it's particularly sad for those people that grew up in Jim Crow, that experienced segregation firsthand, to have the most problems voting. I just think that's, regardless of what party you're for, totally morally wrong.
And which was shocking to me, because Republicans love to boast about, we love the veterans. Both parties do, but particularly Republicans. But there was something about that a veteran couldn't even use his veteran ID.
Well, yeah, I mean, that was another crazy thing. Wisconsin didn't accept veterans' IDs, and so there was a 90-year-old Iwo Jima vet who was turned away from the polls because he only had his veterans' ID card. It just so happened this 90-year-old vet was related to a Wisconsin State Supreme Court justice. So she caused an outcry, and now veterans' IDs are added. So I guess the only way you could stop yourself from being disenfranchised in Wisconsin is if you're related to a state Supreme Court judge. Otherwise, you're not going to get any preferential treatment. But it's crazy. I mean, veterans' IDs, state university issues IDs. I mean, why weren't these IDs part of the law in the first place? These are government-issued IDs. So if you want a government-issued ID to be valid, you should accept all forms of them.
And in Arizona, we saw a huge clusterfuck, and you have in Maricopa County.
Guess we can say that word on there.
Yeah, it's fantastic. Yeah. And you saw in Maricopa County in particular, they shrunk the amount of polling places for that county, but had more polling places for lesser populated counties.
We the people know that our electoral process has been corrupted. This is not some sort of conspiracy theory. This is not some sort of a sick joke, and this is perhaps especially true in Maricopa County. The corruption has become so established that it got comfortable. So comfortable that it got lazy. So lazy that you got caught. Yeah! No more voter suppression!
Has there been any of that where they've been kind of redoing polling places, shrinking the pool of places people could vote?
Not that I've heard of,
okay.
But I didn't know that Maricopa County had closed 70% of polling places until it happened either. Right. So even someone like myself who covers this for an issue is sometimes caught off guard because we can't keep track of what every county in the country is doing on a given day. I mean, one of the things I've been focusing on is just talking about the impact of the Supreme Court gutting the Voting Rights Act and what that meant, what that 2013 decision has meant. We saw the impact in Arizona because Arizona was one of those states that previously had to approve its voting changes with the federal government. So if Maricopa County wanted to close 70% of its polling places, they would have had to get that approved with the federal government. I don't believe that the Justice Department would have approved it because minority voters are such a large percent of Maricopa County. There was clear evidence that Latino voters waited an extremely long time in lines in places like downtown Phoenix. Wisconsin is the place that did not have to approve its voting changes with the federal government, but was sued under the existing parts of the Voting Rights Act. And the fact this law is in place is telling me that the Voting Rights Act as currently construed, the weakened Voting Rights Act, is not strong enough because it should be able to block laws like Wisconsin's voter ID law. There's a clear racial disparity. There's many, many people that don't have ID. There's no evidence of fraud to justify it. And yet this law is in effect because a panel of Republican judges basically said this is constitutional. And the Voting Rights Act was supposed to stop that kind of situation from occurring.
So playing Ari Berman clairvoyant, are you expecting like major problems there tomorrow, or it could go either way?
I'm expecting problems tomorrow. We never know what the problems will be, but I don't think that you can read too much into a primary because in November, turnout is going to be much higher. There's going to be many more contested races. All the way down the ballot, especially in Wisconsin, there's a contested Senate race, which is extremely important because of the Supreme Court now. And not only that, but I think that Republicans are going to be more focused on trying to disenfranchise Democrats in a general election rather than a primary. Right now, Scott Walker's squaring off against Donald Trump, right? But that's not going to be the situation in the general.
Right.
All these guys are going to be united in squaring off against Democrats. So that's where the real impact will be. So I'm saying the fact that we're even seeing problems in the primary, to me, is disturbing. Yeah. Because if we're seeing problems in a primary, we're definitely going to see problems in a general.
And kind of tying into your book a little bit, it's a very great kind of history of voter suppression, voting rights, that kind of ties into modern day as well. But the hysteria over voter fraud that they're using as a clutch for this, is that something new that only came in under Obama when they realized the demographics were changing, or how far does this date back? When did this start?
Concerns about voter fraud are as old as debates over voting itself. I mean, you had concerns over voting fraud in terms of not letting illiterates and other people be able to vote, whether it was in the 1700s or the 1800s, and then after the Voting Rights Act was passed, you certainly had states argue that things like poll taxes were needed to be able to only have quote-unquote educated voters. And so there was definitely concern raised by people like George Wallace in Alabama over voter fraud. But we began to hear a lot more about it in recent times. First, with the second Bush administration, they were really beating the drum for voter fraud. We saw U.S. attorneys, for example, who were fired. Republican-appointed U.S. attorneys were fired in states like New Mexico and Washington State for not aggressively prosecuting voter fraud. These prosecutors basically said there was no voter fraud for us to prosecute, or we would have prosecuted. But it really started then, and then it dramatically escalated after the election of President Obama. And I think that there were a number of Republicans that just believed that the first black president could not be legitimately elected. Right. And not only that, but that voter fraud was a very convenient excuse to then pass policies to make it harder for certain constituencies, Democratic-leaning constituencies, to vote. So I think voter fraud has been a manufactured controversy to try to then restrict the electorate, because no one's ever pointed out any evidence, particularly of voter impersonation. Mm-hmm. If you look at voter impersonation, Wisconsin didn't provide a single case before a federal court. So if they were going to present the evidence, that would have been the time for them to do so. They never did it. Since 2000, there's been 31 cases of voter impersonation out of 1 billion votes cast. So it's not a real problem. And I think that this has been really an excuse to try to manufacture an electorate that's more favorable to one party than another.
Has there been proposed legislation to change it to a federal policy, so that states can't, muddy the waters like that? But there's one federal voting law that, this is the law of the land?
Yeah, well, unfortunately, we have a very federalist system in this country, but there's a lot more that Congress could be doing. Not only could Congress restore the Voting Rights Act, but they could have more standards. Maybe not one law, but they could have basic standards. Every state has to have early voting. They can do that if they wanted to. Every state should have online voter registration. Every state should have a same-day voter registration like Wisconsin has. You can show up, you can register, and vote at the same time. That's one thing Scott Walker has not been able to eliminate because his own son used it in the last election. So there's a lot more that Congress could be doing. We're always going to give power to the states in this country. That's part of the way the American system was created. But that doesn't mean that every state has a right to discriminate and suppress their own voters without federal approval. And so I think there's a lot more that we could be doing.
And is Merrick Garland, to your knowledge, someone, if he became a Supreme Court justice, someone who could be relied on to be a fifth vote to restore the Voting Rights Act?
I think so, but I don't definitively know. He hasn't ruled on that many voting rights cases. He ruled against voting rights for residents of Washington, D.C., which people were not happy about. However, he did strike down Florida's cuts to early voting in 2012 under the Voting Rights Act, so that was a positive sign. I think he's basically a centrist on some issues, a center-left judge, and so I think he'd view the Voting Rights Act favorably, and I think he would look at it empirically as opposed to the conservative justices who are looking at this through a very ideological lens.
Great. Thanks, Ari. I really appreciate it. Maybe I'll see you in Milwaukee tomorrow. And
thanks, Jordan. More. Stay safe at the Trump rally. Talk to you later.